Thanks everyone for joining us today for our 4-session workshop on race and racism in science. My name is Wei Jima. I'm the moderator today, and I'm also the coordinator of the working group that put this workshop together. The workshop is an event held by 3 departments: CNS, psychology, and biology, as well as jointly with the Neuroscience Institute up at the medical school. So the background of this workshop, very briefly, of course, last summer, our 3 departments, much like the rest of the world, started a long overdue reckoning with all aspects of racism. And part of that is, of course, to confront painful truths about our own fields. Because science hasn't existed in a vacuum. Science has never been an innocent bystander. Science has never been value-free, never been magically insulated from the bias or ignorance or twisted motivations of its practitioners. Instead, science has in some cases been complicit or even instrumental in instigating or propagating or tolerating racist ideas and practices. And this workshop is going to highlight many examples of that, with the hope that these lectures can raise our collective awareness, allow us to disseminate what we learn to others, and take action to correct historical and contemporary injustices. In the first 2 sessions, we have a biologist and a sociologist speaking about the conceptualization of race and racism in science. In sessions 3 and 4, we will turn to 2 domain areas that are adjacent to our fields, namely medicine and data science/AI, to examine racist practices in those fields. A little bit about how this workshop came about. It was started as an initiative by the Department of Psychology when last summer a large number of working groups were formed around different aspects of anti-racism. And then later the group came to include students, postdoc faculty from all 3 departments, so including CNS and biology, and as well as the Neuroscience Institute uptown. What we did as a working group was we educated ourselves, we read and discussed the book together, we looked at best practices at other institutions, we formulated this proposal for a short course, and then we decided on topics and speakers. I would like to recognize and thank the members of the working group: Catherine Hu, Helena Palmieri, Malmo Gami, Tim Wallstein, Tim Reckard, David Gresham, Mike Hocken, David Chopik, David Chiquitano, Asher Kaslin, Habon Issa, Christine Constantinople, Andre Fenton, Ashton Murray, Nihan Parawuti, Karen Morandel, and Sean Froudist-Walsh. Thank you very much. There have been some questions about the attendance requirements. So our working group originally wanted to make this workshop mandatory for everybody in the departments, just because we think that educating ourselves on these topics shouldn't be optional. But then we quickly discovered that there is no meaningful mechanism to make things mandatory for faculty, so that was not possible. But at the same time, we are very well aware that faculty are the group with the most power, and of course they're also going to be around for the longest, so they have a special responsibility to participate in this self-education. And in order to encourage participation by faculty, the chairs of the 3 departments have sent numerous emails to the faculty, group emails and individual emails. And I'm very glad to say that the vast majority of the faculty in all 3 departments are in attendance today. And special thanks to all of you who were not obligated to take this course and who are taking time out of their schedule to attend. And we hope that this is going to be an event where we can grow as a community. So I would like to now give the floor to Monroe Friends, who is the Associate Vice President for Global Engagement and Inclusive Leadership at NYU, for some remarks. Monroe.
Thank you, Luigi. Thank you very much for inviting me in to be a part of this conversation today, and everyone else again who've been a part of the work group, and and everyone who has made these conversations possible. I'm Monroe Friends, as Luigi mentioned. I'm Associate Vice President for Global Engagement and Strategic Leadership within the Office of Global Inclusion. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am really delighted to be a part of this conversation today, though of course I wish it was in the backdrop of a very different moment in a very different time. Here we are. I think that I applaud you for having this conversation, because it's so critical that we look at how our disciplines and our fields continue to perpetuate or promulgate, or either our histories that exist that we cannot ignore when it comes to racism, in science, racism in health, racism in research. And we know racism exists in all of our fields, right? And so it's not just in the sciences. Before I start, I wanted to also take just a moment to acknowledge, as I mentioned just moments ago, this backdrop that we're in around racism as we sit here and wait for the Siobhan case to be decided, as we know the ongoing violence and horrific acts of violence against our Asian communities, the ongoing shootings of Black people by police officers, and just the ongoing xenophobia that has having grave impacts on so many of our community members, and then just every other act of xenophobia and violence. This is why, exactly and precisely why this conversation is important today. What we know is that, that again, as Luigi already mentioned, that there have been historical incidents from eugenics in the US, in the UK, which Professor Gresham is going to speak on today. Over the 40 years of the Tuskegee syphilis study that happened to Black communities, which, when you think about that history to this moment today, it explains why so many communities of color have fear of science, right? Are reticent about even getting the COVID vaccine, right? Those things have impacts. Historical acts of harm have current impacts on our communities in ways in which that we think about science. We also know that people with disabilities and women, in science, in the science, have been experimented on, have had really grave impacts of things that have happened to them, from sterilization. And then we look at the intersections of race, right? Those impacts are even more grave. So when we think about the ways in which that, science and our historical practices of how we think about research have had impacts, in order for us to move on, and I think about the words of, James Baldwin when he said, "Nothing can be changed until it's faced." Facing our past and facing our histories, I know, is ugly and it's complicated. But in order for us to not revisit those really dangerous practices, we must understand its impact historically and to create new pathways forward. So one of the upcoming series we're going to be doing in OGI that just builds on sort of the conversation that you're already having, within psychology, neuroscience, and your other areas that you're partnering with today, is around the disproportionate impacts and differential impacts that bias in health has on Black communities. So we're partnering the Office of Global Inclusion with an external organization called Ubiquita to start a series, which we hope eventually will become a television series, as a matter of fact, on looking at the differential impacts and disparate impacts in healthcare, and also how systemic racism impacts the lives of Black people. So this conversation, again, I think is so critical. We also just see examples of, even when you feel like you're doing right, even when you're a medical practitioner. So the case of Dr. Susan Moore, a Black physician who died of COVID and taped her experiences in the hospital to speak to the ways in which that she experienced bias in healthcare, even as a doctor. So when we talk about like the importance of ensuring that we bring to the forefront the ways in which racism exists in science and health, I cannot think of a more critical time to do it. And in higher education, in the academy, as a matter of fact, it's our moral imperative to do so. From whether we're teaching, whether we're researchers, whether we're like emerging faculty, or if we're students. What we do in the university setting helps to inform the shape of our future. And so this is why I think this conversation is so critical. And I'm so very happy that you're looking at it from a holistic perspective of bringing in the faculty, your students, and your researchers. The last thing I'll end with is I've been reflecting quite a bit around artificial intelligence, around robotics. We've already seen the ways in which if we are not mindful, that it could continue to be used in really problematic and dangerous ways. We embed our bias into our science. Who we decide to study or who we don't study, like it's shaped and informed by our societal realities. We also know that the New York Police Department is using a robotic dog to monitor public housing right now. To me, that's dangerous and scary, causing greater sense of surveillance and stress on already marginalized communities. And so as we hold today's conversation, I'll ask us to not only think about sort of the amazing presentation that we're going to hear, I will also ask us to think about the ways in which these experiences have differential and disproportionate impacts on already marginalized and racialized people. I will ask us to think about the ways in which that our peers that you're studying with, our students in the classroom, are experiencing this moment and the impact it has on them of having to then move into a field in which they're not only like represented, like have the burden of representation as underrepresented people or minoritized people or communities of color, right? They're also then having to navigate the realities of racism in the field. So let's hold those individuals and center those stories and experiences in the conversation today. I'll ask us to lean into today's conversation to learn, to lean into it as an opportunity to think about the ways in which that we can think about our practice in new ways. And finally, I'll ask us to think about this experience as a way to learn and grow. Growth mindset is critical. In order for us to do better and be better, we have to be in the journey. So I look at today as a moment for us to continue collectively as a community to reflect on what journey we want to move in and how we use this learning opportunity, this 4-part like workshop, as an opportunity to grow as practitioners, as learners, and as teachers and educators. So with that, I want to say thank you. Look forward to the learning that will happen today. And once again, I appreciate being a part of this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to, I think, Emily, who will speak a bit more about sort of the next steps of the conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monroe. Thank you for opening up this conversation today. I'm Emily Balchetis. I'm a professor in the psychology department, and I'm here today as a faculty member who wants to learn. But I'm also here in my capacity as the diversity and inclusion coordinator for the psychology department in arts and sciences. My role today in that regard is to provide support for our community, particularly the members of our community who identify as underrepresented, and especially those who are on the call today and in the weeks moving forward. There are many advantages of coming together for conversations like these, but there are also challenges that come with different experiences and backgrounds that we bring to the table as we engage with this conversation. So you know, I'll stay in this Zoom room for 30 minutes after the session this week, and also for each week moving forward. For anybody who'd like to stick around to digest this conversation more. You can also email me or send me a direct chat message to the panelists to set up a private conversation if there's something that sparks your interest and you want to dive deeper with a smaller group of people, or to talk with just me individually. We realize that the experiences of participating in this session might be different for members of different groups. So I see it as something that I can offer to support our varied experiences of our community, those different experiences we might have today and in the sessions moving forward, by being present and available to help us navigate these conversations and the experiences we might have after. So please take advantage, if you'd like, of the opportunity to reflect on your experiences with me today and in the weeks going forward.
Thank you, Emily. A couple of logistical remarks. Questions for our speaker will go into the Q&A, and you can post anonymously if you wish. You can change your screen name. You can also upvote questions by others. For general discussion, please feel free to use the chat, for example, to share resources, but make sure to be mindful and respectful of the tone of the conversation. Feedback for the workshop itself, will be solicited through a survey after the 4th session of the workshop. Emily already mentioned that she will be having a debrief session in this Zoom webinar right after the lecture. In addition, there will be another debrief session organized by NeuroPill, the Neuroscience Graduate Council, which is going to focus on the recommended readings for today. And the link for that is going to be provided in the chat. All that's left is to introduce today's speaker. David Gresham is a professor of biology at NYU. His research is on the interface of molecular biology and evolution. He did his PhD in human genetics and was previously an editor at Nature Genetics. When he was faculty at Princeton, he developed and taught an undergraduate writing course on science, race, and racism. David will speak about the history of race as a scientific concept. David.
Well, thanks so much, Wei-Ji, for that introduction, and thank you, Munro, for those really important words to start us off. So actually, my goal today is to generate a discussion. And so I'm going to put some prompts just on the first page here. And just so you can keep these questions in mind as my presentation progresses. And I'll just leave a minute for you either to write down some notes on what these questions are, or take a screenshot if you can, and then I'll get into it. So the title of my talk today is The Historical Origins of Scientific Racism, but just to sort of orient us and make it all very real for us, I just want to start with something that's very familiar, very familiar for many of us who have been coming to the NYU campus for the last few months, and that is through the submission through the Binks company of our tests for COVID. And, many of us have been doing this every couple of weeks. We have to go through the process on the website to successfully activate your box. And in order to successfully activate your box, you have to answer the following questions. Which of the following best describes your ethnic group, Hispanic or Latino, not Hispanic or Latino, or other? And which of the following best describes your race? Please select all that apply. And so we have to make a decision here about, which race do we self-identify with on, a regular basis. And this, in fact, is consistent in this sort of biomedical setting with the NIH policy and guidelines on the inclusion of women and minorities as subjects in clinical research. So the NIH classifies a minority group as a readily identifiable subset of the US population that's distinguished by racial, ethnic, and/or cultural heritage. And they state that principal investigators should assess the theoretical and/or scientific linkages between sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and their topic of study. The NIH defines for us what the ethnic categories are. They define ethnic categories as being either Hispanic or Latino, which is a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American or other Spanish cultural origins, regardless of race, or not Hispanic or Latino. And they define the following racial categories for minority racial categories as individuals belonging to either American Indian or Native Alaskan Natives, Asians, Black or African American, or Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander. And these definitions are, or these categories are all defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of a particular part of the world. It's interesting within this definition that the NIH provides for us that in fact we see the fluidity and arbitrary nature of racial definitions. The Asian category includes people of the Philippine Islands, but the NIH states that individuals from the Philippine Islands have been recorded as Pacific Islanders in previous data collection strategies. So the question for us then is what is race? And in fact, if you look at consensus thinking in the academy, as reported by the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, the American Anthropological Association, or the American Sociological Association, or the American Society of Human Genetics, in consensus statements that have been made by these academic groups. These are summarized in Angela Saini's excellent recent book, Superior, The Return of Race Science, in which she states that race has been accepted by academics as a social reality, not a biological one. Race affects how we live, but not who we are genetically. And this is indeed the consensus thinking amongst scientists today. But what I want to do in this lecture, and as Monroe pointed out, we need to look at our history, is I want to convey to you that this concept of race originated as a scientific concept. It came about in the 18th century and was introduced as a typological classification. And I want to take you through the history of race as a scientific concept and its use in the 19th century for the justification of European superiority, and then the history throughout the 20th century, in which at the beginning of the century it was used as the rationale for discrimination and oppression as manifest through the Eugenics movement. It's culminated in the mid-20th century as providing a scientific justification for the Holocaust, but that we see in the late 20th century that there's been a refutation of the scientific basis of race. But then I want to take you into the 21st century to discuss some of the ways in which race and ancestry remain included in biomedical studies. And I'm going to give you just some examples of how science can still be appropriated for racist agendas and for the perpetuation of stereotypes, and touch on a couple of the current issues in the incorporation of genetic ancestry in biomedical studies. And what I hope to do is get us to the point where we can have a discussion of some of the prompts that I've provided with you, or any other questions that you come up throughout my presentation today. I just want to make some caveats about my talk today. So I am talking about the history of scientific racism, and so I am going to use some archaic terminology that is no longer used and is repellent for many of us. And I just want to point out right from the beginning that the history of racism in science is truly abhorrent and horrible, but I'm not going to end every slide by saying, and this is absolutely terrible. I just will state that from the outset, and I'm hoping to convey to you some of the relevant information. My lecture is really focused on European and North American scientists, and I've relied primarily on primary and secondary sources. And as a result, the historical record and what has been written subsequently about scientific racism is really limited in information on scientists who opposed scientific racism. And so I have very few examples to offer you with regards to that. The other key point, of course, is that, as we've heard in the introduction, that science is very much intertwined with the social milieu, and the history of scientific racism certainly is as well. I'll point out some cases in which we can see a clear example, but I'm not going to do that extensively, and I think that's something that you can do. You can think about the context in which this research and these ideas were being promoted. So to start off, there's two key components that we need to think about when we think about the introduction of race as a scientific concept amongst European scientists. And the first is the Great Chain of Being. This was the European conceptualization of the living world that had a hierarchy that sort of placed living beings and indicated who had authority over who. And so this hierarchical structure placed, for example, plants down the bottom and God at the top. Just below God were the angels, and then the humans, and then animals and other forms of life. And so there was very much a hierarchical thinking about how life was ordered. In addition, this is occurring, the introduction of race as a scientific idea is occurring in the context of European exploration, where Europeans were going out and sailing across the oceans and interacting with people from different parts of the world that they had never interacted with previously. So it was in this context that Carl Linnaeus in 1735 published Systema Naturae. This was a very important text in which Linnaeus introduced the nomenclature that we still use today that classifies organisms in terms of classes and species, for example. Now, Linnaeus published many editions over the course of his life, and in the first 9 editions, he classified humans into 4 distinct varieties. Those varieties you can see on your screen there. This is the Americanus, the Europaeus, Asiaticus, and the Africanus. And these varieties were classified on the basis of physical characteristics such as skin color. Linnaeus was one of the first to advance the idea that human beings are animals, and he named our species Homo sapiens as the animals that know thyself. And in correspondence, it's clear that Linnaeus concluded that Homo sapiens comprised a single species. He stated that if the slightest trait or difference was sufficient, there would easily stick out thousands of different species of man, and who with a sane mind would be so frivolous as to call these distinct species. By the 10th edition, Linnaeus's categories became hierarchical and incorporated social and cultural factors and bias, as you can see here. And so in this case, the varieties are in a hierarchy with Americanus actually at the top and Africanus at the bottom. And Linnaeus not only used physical characteristics to classify these different varieties of Homo sapiens, but used, for example, behavioral traits, classifying Europaeus as being characterized as having light, wise, and inventor-like behavior, whereas Asiaticus was stern, haughty, and greedy. We can see when we look at the features that Linnaeus used in his categorization, that many of these claims or these features reflect stereotypes of the day. And what is important and consistent throughout all of Linnaeus's categorizations in his hierarchy is that Africanus was always at the bottom, largely described by negative factors, as you can see here. In addition to these 4 varieties of humans, Linnaeus also included 2 additional varieties of humans, Homo monstrous and Homo ferus, and some examples shown here of the individuals that belong to these additional 2 varieties of humans. And I put this here just for historical context so you can see some of Linnaeus's thinking and question whether it was necessarily resulting from empirical research. It was in his English translation in 1792 that Linnaeus introduced this trinomial nomenclature of genus, species, and subspecies. And in doing so, he really entrenched the idea that there are different, this concept that there are different subspecies of humans. And this is a replication of Linnaeus's English translation here, where you can see the different varieties that he has included, and this subspecies nomenclature that has persisted for many, many years. Following Linnaeus's work, Johann Blumenbach, who was considered the founder of comparative zoology and anthropology, addressed the question of the different types of human races. He used, for example, skull measurements and different morphologies in order to define a typology of human races. And he defined 5 types of humans: the Caucasian or white race, the Mongolian or yellow race, the Malayan or brown race, the Ethiopian or black race, and the American or red race. Blumenbach's classification was hierarchical, and he advanced the degenerative hypothesis, which is articulated here. He stated that I have allotted the first place to the Caucasians, as I esteem it to be the primeval one, that is, descended from Adam and Eve. And then this diverges in both directions into the Ethiopian and the Mongolian, and the remaining intermediate positions between the primeval one and those 2 extremes. And so his classification was inherently hierarchical. It's interesting to note that it was Blumenbach who introduced the term Caucasian. He used this term because for the Caucasian variety, he said, I have taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus because it produces the most beautiful race of men, I mean the Georgians, the greatest probability to place the origins of mankind in this area here is shown on the map. And he stated that this stock displays the most beautiful form of the skull. It is white in color, the primitive color of mankind, for it is easy for that to degenerate into brown, but much more difficult for brown to become white when the secretion and precipitation of this carbonaceous pigment has once deeply struck root. And it's interesting for us to reflect on the fact that this term, Caucasian, is still used very frequently in common discourse, and I question whether people know it's the origins of this terminology. Darwin's publication in the middle of the 1800s on the origins of the species by means of natural selection and preservation of favored races in the struggle for life had little to offer with regards to human beings. Darwin stuck to animals in his seminal work, but he subsequently published additional works, including The Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex. But he really had little to say about the different categories of humans. He did weigh in on the argument stating that the most weighty of all the arguments against treating the races of man as distinct species is that they can graduate into each other independently in many cases, as far as we can judge, of their having intercrossed. He did, however, state that at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. But it was actually his cousin, Francis Galton, who took those Darwinian ideas and advances in understanding of human heredity to introduce the concept of eugenics. So Galton, as pictured here, was a polymath who was involved in many different areas of research to do with human heredity and statistics. If you use linear regression, Galton was the originator of that method. And Galton introduced this concept of eugenics, which stated that what nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly. As it lies within his power, so it becomes his duty to work in that direction. And this eugenics idea became extremely popular amongst the scientific thinkers of the day, those who were involved in discovering human heredity and its underlying basis. And the idea was that, as shown in this Eugenics Society poster from the 1930s, is that we needed to harness our new knowledge of human heredity and Darwinian fitness in order to direct humankind to release the burden of heredity, disease, and unfitness. Galton was particularly interested in the inheritance of intelligence and published the book Hereditary Genius, in which he, one of the chapters is entitled The Comparative Worth of Different Races. And Darwin stated that I shall make frequent use of the law of deviation from an average. He was a quantitative thinker. I shall assume the intervals between the grades of ability are the same in all races, a result which again points to the conclusion that the average intellectual standard of the Negro is some 2 grades below our own. As a British scientist at the turn of the century, he of course assigned the ablest race of whom history bears record is unquestionably the ancient Greeks. But here in this excerpt from this chapter, we can see the clear racist thinking of leading scientific thinkers of the day. The concept of eugenics gained a foothold in the UK, but it became particularly popular when it crossed the Atlantic and developed in US academic institutions during the earliest 20th century. One of the earliest advocates and promoters of eugenics was Charles Davenport, who was a poultry chicken geneticist. But he sought to use the power of our newfound understanding of human inheritance and evolution to direct the evolution of human society. Whereas in the UK, the eugenics movement is considered positive eugenics, positive in this case because this entailed the promotion of marriages and matings that would result in children with desirable traits. In the US, this was taken to the extreme, and the so-called negative eugenics called for preventing the reproduction of the genetically unfit, possibly by state-enforced sterilization. In this case, the argument was that if the state had the right to take away life, why shouldn't the state have the right to prevent undesirable births? And Davenport was really at the forefront of this thinking and advocacy. This was, he was funded by philanthropists and tycoons, and established the Carnegie Station for Experimental Evolution at Cold Spring Harbor, and then the Eugenics Record Office, which is where the present-day Cold Spring Harbor laboratories sit. You might recognize this shot here. This is from that period, but this is exactly the same shot that we often see of Cold Spring Harbor laboratories. Eugenic scientists like Charles Davenport advanced racist ideas under the guise of eugenics thinking. Davenport studied the effects of race intermingling famously in Jamaica, and published the article making the following claim that one often sees in mulattoes an ambition and push combined with intellectual inadequacy, which makes the unhappy hybrid dissatisfied with his lot and a nuisance to others. Miscegenation, which is the marriage between people of different races, commonly spells disharmony. And he stated that a hybridized people are a badly put together people and a dissatisfied, restless, and ineffective people. Davenport's ideas were not some fringe idea. Eugenics was taught as cutting-edge science in academic institutions throughout the United States. Here are 2 textbooks Genetics and Eugenics by Castle, and Applied Genetics by Paul Popenoe and Roswell Johnson. And these were the textbooks that were used in eugenics classes throughout all US academic institutions. In these textbooks were, for example, chapters such as the one I'm showing here, The Color Line, in which Popenoe cites the work of Ferguson on the relative intelligence of Negroes and whites, in which Ferguson quantifies the racial purity of people with respect to their intelligence, and concludes that the Negro is out of his environment in the United States. He is much less fit in the Darwinian sense and is eugenically inferior. Society, white society, long ago reached the instinctive conclusion that it must put a ban on intermarriage between the two races. And so here we see how textbooks and current scientific thinking was used to advance and justify racist policies. The eugenics movement in the US gained incredible popularity. Here is a certificate that was awarded to Emeritus exhibit at the International Congress of Eugenics in 1921 at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And we can see here that eugenics is promoted as an interdisciplinary effort that combines genetics, anthropology, statistics, sociology, psychology in order to better human stock. It permeated out into all aspects of society. Here is a photograph of the Fitter Families contestants at the 1924 Georgia State Fair in Savannah. And state fairs were used as venues for educating people about eugenics and judging human stock to select the most eugenically fit in contests. And eugenics, as advocated by science and scientists, was used as the justification for policies that restricted immigration in the US, for anti-miscegenation laws that prevented marriages between people of different races, and then for the compulsory sterilization of peoples of African American, Latina, and Native American descent. And actually in many states, as shown here, there were executive agencies that carried out sterilizations in the name of eugenics. American eugenics crossed back across the Atlantic and was incorporated into Nazi thinking and in the concept of racial hygiene. So on your screen here, you're looking at a excerpt from a high school textbook in which the burden on society is depicted by people of different abilities or different races. And the concept of Rassenhygiene entailed the scientists who provided the scientific backing for many of the Nazi policies. And these scientists were university professors from the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which is the predecessor of the Max Planck Society. And these ideas were very much inspired by the thinking and the adoption of the eugenic policies in the United States. And here are a couple of books that discuss this very close connection. It's clear that in Nazi Germany that scientists and science provided the justification for the Nazi atrocities as manifest in the Nuremberg race laws that defined people's race on the basis of their heredity, and then culminated in the Holocaust and the loss of millions of lives. It was in this context that following the Second World War, the voices of scholars who had been fighting against some of this racist ideology that was in the scientific mainstream thinking of the time, such as the anthropologists Franz Boas and Ashley Montagu, spearheaded the 1950 UNESCO Statement on Race. In this preamble, they state that the importance which the problem of race has acquired in the modern world scarcely needs to be pointed out. Mankind will not soon forget the injustices and crimes which give such tragic overtones to the word race. And this was a statement that was drafted under the aegis of UNESCO by leading scientists from different parts of the world, including, for example, Claude Lévi-Strauss, a famous anthropologist, and Dubzhansky, a famous geneticist, along with Kurt Stern. In this statement, the committee asserted human equality based on four premises: that the mental capacities of all races are similar, that no evidence exists for biological deterioration as a result of hybridization, there is no correlation between national or religious groups and any particular race, and that race was less a biological fact than a social myth, and that biology proved the universal brotherhood of man. An important subsequent study in 1972, entitled The Apportionment of Human Diversity by the geneticist Richard Lewontin, took human polymorphisms that could be measured at the time, which were from protein polymorphisms as detected in blood, and took peoples from different populations that belonged to the so-called races, as you can see on your screen here, including the Caucasians, Black Africans, Mongoloids, etc. And what Lewontin did in this study is he studied the frequency distribution of these alleles in these different populations, and applying a method that is essentially like an ANOVA method, in which the variance is partitioned within populations and between populations. Lewontin found that the mean proportion of the total species diversity that is contained within populations is 85.4%, and that only 6.3% is accounted for by racial classification. He concluded in this paper that it is clear that our perception of relatively large differences between human races and subgroups as compared to the variation within these groups is indeed a biased perception, and that based on randomly chosen genetic differences, human races and populations are remarkably similar to each other, with the largest part by far of human variation being accounted for by the differences between individuals. He went on to say that human racial classification is of no social value and is positively destructive of human and social relations. And since such racial classification is now seen to be of virtually no genetic or taxonomic significance either, no justification can be offered for its continuance. And indeed, this metric of 85% of the diversity occurring within populations is one that you frequently hear quoted to this date. A subsequent important study around the turn of the century looked at the genetic structure of human populations, Rosenberg et al. And in this study, they had access to many more genetic markers. They looked at 377 genetic markers in 1,000 or so individuals from different populations, and using these data, concluded that within population differences among individuals account for 93 to 95% of genetic variation. And the differences amongst major groups constitute only 3 to 5% of genetic variation. They did, however, go on to say that nevertheless, without using prior information about the origins of individuals, we identified 6 main genetic clusters, and these are the clusters shown down the bottom here using the clustering method developed by Jonathan Pritchard, and 5 of which correspond to the major geographic regions. Around the time of this study and subsequently, there have been a number of major population genetic studies that have sought to characterize genetic diversity within and between populations. In the 1990s, there was an effort to undertake the Human Genome Diversity Project. And then in the 2000s, there was the Haplotype Map Project, or the HapMap Project. And in the 2010s, there was the 1,000 Genomes Project. And these different projects have been, the motivation for them has often been technological advancements that allow increased resolution of genetic variation between and within populations. If you look at post Second World War terminology in these publications, it's clear that scientific studies published since that time have attempted to distance this research from race science. So rather than using the term race, the terminologies that are often used are geographic populations, continent of origin, biodiversity. Rather than hybrids, these studies use terminology like admixed populations and talk about ancestry or genetic ancestry. And where race is used, it is typically defined as self-reported race. Racism has persisted and continues to persist in science since the Second World War in many different cases. Here are some of the most notorious cases. The psychologist J. Philip Rushton published the book Race, Evolution, and Behavior in the 80s, in which he essentially attempted to recapitulate the sort of studies that Galton had done around the beginning of the 1900s. And then the notorious bell curve was published in the 1990s that made the argument that there were innate intelligence differences between people of different racial groups. And then one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA and the director of the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories, Jim Watson, is notorious for espousing racist and sexist pontifications that have been tolerated by the scientific community for many, many years until very recently. And these racist science and scientists have been particularly pernicious, and because racism that emanates from the academy has great weight. And so I think this is important for us to be aware of these examples and vigilant in our thinking. Even when we have the best of intents and purposes, contemporary culture can still appropriate scientific findings related to human genetic variation. So an example that I'm showing you here is, I'll see if I can get this to run for you. So you can look at watch these young men. In this case, what these young men are doing is chugging milk. And this is motivated by a scientific study that was published in Nature Genetics at the beginning of the 2000s that identified a variant associated with adult type hyperlactasia. So this is the ability to metabolize lactose through adulthood. And in this case, this variant was identified in Northern Europeans, the Finns, and then other Northern Europeans. And this is part of the underlying basis of the ability, the difference between people who are lactose tolerant and lactose intolerant. And so you can see here these young men demonstrating their racial purity by their ability to chug milk. Unfortunately, in this case, there's a missed opportunity here, because this is a very interesting example of convergent evolution, as there are African populations in which independently mutations have arisen that have conferred this identical trait. More recently, it's become very popular to assess your genetic ancestry through organizations like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. And I just want to take a moment to watch this advertisement here.
Greatness lives within all of us. And with Ancestry DNA on sale for just $69, now is the time to discover yours. You can find out where you get your precision, your grace, your drive. And now, with more than 150 ethnic regions to connect to, only Ancestry DNA can put your greatness on full display. Save 30% now at ancestrydna.com.
So I show you this because in this advertisement, this is a company that's using cutting edge technology and population genetics to identify your ancestry. And yet they seem to be implying that particular traits are associated with particular people, that your precision comes from your Scandinavian ancestry, your grace comes from your Asian ancestry, and your drive comes from your British ancestry. it is clear that race impacts human health, and disparities that we are experiencing today with the COVID pandemic. So here is data from the COVID tracking project that confirms that Black people have died at a 1.4 times the rate of white people during the current pandemic. This can be explained, or this is consistent with the idea that race is a social construct, and really that the risk factor for increased morbidity here is racism. However, I wanted to ask the question of what is the impact of ignoring genetic differences between humans? And I think there's an important example that we're in the midst of right now. So the cutting edge approach in population genetics at the moment is to do case control studies in which individuals who have a particular condition, like cardiovascular disease, for example, are genotyped throughout the genome, and individuals who are in a control group are genotyped. And then a statistical test is performed to identify variants that increase one's risk for that particular disease. If we look at recent history at the proportion of people who have been involved in these genome-wide association studies, we can see that there's a huge overrepresentation of people of European ancestry relative to their representation in the global population, as shown on the right here. And that many of the minority racial groups are underrepresented in this undertaking. That is the basis of personalized medicine. The idea here is that population studies can be performed to identify variants that increase one's risk for a particular disease, and then that information can be used to predict for individuals what their risk is of acquiring a particular disease. And because of this bias sampling in these GWAS studies, this promise of personalized medicine is negatively impacted. So if we look here at the prediction accuracy of known genetic risk factors relative to its prediction accuracy in Europeans, we can see that people of different populations, though the utility of that information is greatly reduced. And so there's a clear negative impact of this bias sampling in these genetic studies. And so I'll conclude there by just reiterating what I've conveyed to you today, that despite our modern conception of race as a social construct, that race very much originated as a scientific concept, that science was used as justification for racist policies for several hundred years, and that scientists played a key role in advocating and advancing these racist policies, but that following the atrocities of World War II, scientists rejected the biological concept of race, and race is now considered to be a social construct by scientists. Nonetheless, the classification of humans based on a conflation of ancestry, physical characters, genetics, and social factors remains very much an unsolved issue in science and medicine. And just with this history in mind, and just relevant, salient to our discussion that I'd like to have today, is a paper that was just published last week in Science by Shirley Tillman and Bruce Alberts and Harold Varmus, amongst others, in which they lay out for us in stark reality the disproportionate representation of different racial groups within the academy. So in red here, looking at percentages, are the national proportion of white individuals, Black individuals, Hispanic individuals, and indigenous individuals. And you can clearly see the low diversity that is evident at all levels of, in the academy. And I think these are important data for us to reflect on when we think about and look at the history of our fields. And so I'd like to conclude there by acknowledging some groups. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the graduate biology group here at NYU and the biology department anti-racist reading group, who gave me some really excellent feedback on my talk today. And I would like to recognize the efforts of the NYU biology staff, postdocs, and students who, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement during the summer of 2020, coalesced and wrote a document in which they outlined many great ideas of how we can begin to address inequities in our department and university. And their efforts were really compelled me to join them in this journey through this way. And I would like to thank Wei Ji for spearheading this, this effort and allowing me to be part of it. And I'll post now, again, the questions that I presented at the beginning of my talk. And thank you all for your attention.